W2's youngest heroes, too young to fight. But they did. The Marine recruiter stares at the boy standing in front of him. The kid says he's 18, but he looks 12. Maybe 13 if you're generous. Show me your birth certificate, the recruiter says. The boy pulls out a document. It says he was born in 1924. That would make him 18 in 1942. Old enough to enlist. The recruiter looks at the birth certificate, then at the boy, then back at the certificate. He knows it's fake. Everyone knows it's fake. This child is maybe 14 years old, standing here trying to enlist in the United States Marine Corps. The recruiter should send him home, should call his parents, should refuse to let a child join the military. Instead, he stamps the papers. Welcome to the Marines, son. That boy's name was Jacqueline Lucas. He was 14 years old, and 2 years later, he would throw himself onto grenades to save his squad, becoming the youngest Medal of Honor recipient in WW2'S history. 14 years old. Let that sink in. A child who should have been in middle school was jumping out of landing crafts onto the beaches of Iwo Jima. A kid who couldn't legally drive was fighting one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. And he wasn't alone. During World War II, tens of thousands of children fought in combat. Some lied about their age. Some had their parents' permission. Some were conscripted by desperate governments. And some were so young that no one even asked their age because everyone knew the truth didn't matter anymore. 12-year-olds manning anti-aircraft guns in Germany. 13-year-olds fighting in the Soviet Army. 15-year-olds dying on D-Day beaches. 16-year-olds flying bomber missions over Europe. These weren't accidents. These weren't mistakes. These were children, deliberately put into combat, because the war was so desperate that nations ran out of adults to send. Welcome to Echoes of W2. I'm your host. Today we're going to tell you about the youngest heroes of World War II. Children who fought, who killed, who died, who did things no child should ever have to do. These stories are shocking, they're heartbreaking, and they're going to make you question everything you thought you knew about this war, because your history teacher told you about soldiers. Today, you're going to learn about children. Jacqueline Lucas. The 14-year-old Marine. Let's start with Jacqueline Lucas, because his story sounds completely impossible. A 14-year-old Marine, fighting at Iwo Jima. It can't be true, but it is. Every detail is documented, verified, real. Lucas was born in 1928 in North Carolina. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, he was 13 years old. He became obsessed with joining the military. He wanted to fight, to serve, to be part of the war. His mother said no. Absolutely not. You're a child. You're not going to war. So Lucas did what desperate kids do. He forged documents. He created a fake birth certificate saying he was born in 1924, not 1928. He walked into a Marine recruiting office on his 14th birthday and enlisted. The recruiter knew the documents were fake. Had to know. But by 1942, the Marines needed men. They were taking casualties in the Pacific. Recruitment standards were flexible. Lucas was accepted. He went through boot camp. At 14, he was the smallest, youngest recruit. But he was tough, determined, and kept up with men twice his age. Then came a problem. Lucas was assigned to a training unit in Hawaii. He wouldn't be sent into combat because he was too young and too inexperienced. He'd spend the war training other Marines while they went off to fight. Lucas found this unacceptable. He hadn't lied his way into the Marines to sit out the war in Hawaii. So he went AWOL. He stowed away on a transport ship, heading to Iwo Jima. Think about this. A 14-year-old child deserted his post, snuck onto a ship, and deliberately went to one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. Most adults would do anything to avoid Iwo Jima. Lucas fought to get there. When he was discovered on the ship, it was too late to send him back. The ship was already approaching Iwo Jima. The commanders were furious, but they had no choice. Lucas would land with the Marines. February 20th, 1945. D-Day +1 at Iwo Jima. Lucas went ashore with the 5th Marine Division. He was 17 by now, having turned 17 during the voyage. Still illegally enlisted since he'd used a fake birth certificate. Still a child by any reasonable standard. The fighting was immediately brutal. Japanese positions on Iwo Jima were heavily fortified. Marines were dying by the hundreds. Lucas's unit advanced inland, taking casualties with every yard gained. Then Lucas and 3 other Marines found themselves in a trench, facing 11 Japanese soldiers. Close quarters combat. Rifles and grenades. Chaos. 2 Japanese grenades landed in the trench, right between Lucas and the other Marines. Into seconds, everyone in that trench would die. Lucas threw himself on both grenades, covered them with his body. The grenades exploded under him, launching him into the air. His body absorbed the blasts meant for his squad. One of the Marines with Lucas later said, "He was just a kid. Looked like he should be playing baseball, not fighting. Then he jumped on those grenades without hesitating. Saved all our lives." Lucas should have died. The explosions were directly under his body. Over 250 pieces of shrapnel embedded in his chest, neck, and face. His internal organs were damaged. He was bleeding massively, but he didn't die. Medics reached him. They evacuated him. He survived long enough to reach a field hospital, then a hospital ship. Against all odds, he lived. The doctors said it was a miracle. They'd never seen anyone survive being that close to grenade explosions. Some of the shrapnel was too close to vital organs to be safely removed. Lucas would carry metal fragments in his body for the rest of his life. Lucas was awarded the Medal of Honor. When President Truman presented it to him, Lucas was still 17 years old, the youngest Marine to ever receive the Medal of Honor, the youngest serviceman to receive it in World War II. But here's what should haunt you about this story. Lucas fought at Iwo Jima. He threw himself on grenades. He nearly died. And he was still 2 years away from being old enough to vote. He couldn't legally drink, couldn't sign a contract, couldn't get married without parental permission. But he could die for his country, because someone stamped fake papers and sent a child to war. Lucas survived the war. He lived until 2008, dying at age 80. He spent his life dealing with injuries from those grenades. Chronic pain, surgeries to remove shrapnel that had worked its way toward vital organs, physical limitations. In interviews later in life, Lucas was asked if he regretted lying about his age to enlist. He always said no. He was proud of his service, proud of saving his squad, proud to be a Marine. But he'd also say, "No 14-year-old should go to war. I did what I thought I had to do. But looking back, I was a child. I should have been in school, not in combat." That's the tragedy. Lucas became a hero. He saved lives. He earned the nation's highest military honor. And he should never have been there in the first place. Calvin Graham. The 12-year-old Navy sailor. If Jacqueline Lucas's story seems impossible, wait until you hear about Calvin Graham. Because Lucas was 14 when he enlisted, Graham was 12. 12 years old. 6th grade. Still playing with toys. And he joined the US Navy. Graham was born in 1930 in Texas. His home life was difficult. Abusive stepfather. Poverty. He wanted to escape. And in 1942, when he was 12 years old, he saw his chance. He forged his mother's signature on enlistment papers. He practiced deepening his voice. He stood as tall as he could. He walked into a Navy recruiting office and said he was 17. The recruiter looked at this tiny kid, barely 5 feet tall, weighing maybe 90 pounds, claiming to be 17. And he accepted him, because by 1942, the Navy needed sailors. They just lost ships at Pearl Harbor. They were preparing for major Pacific operations. Standards were flexible. Graham went through boot camp. At 12, he was the smallest recruit. Other sailors called him baby. But he completed training and was assigned to the USS South Dakota, a battleship. November 1942. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, one of the largest naval battles of the Pacific War. The South Dakota was hit multiple times by Japanese shells. Fires broke out across the ship. Men were dying. The ship was in danger of sinking. Graham, 12 years old, manned an anti-aircraft gun during the battle. When the ship was hit and fire started, he helped fight the fires and rescue wounded sailors. He pulled men from burning compartments. He helped treat the wounded, despite having no medical training. The South Dakota survived the battle. Graham survived, but he'd collected shrapnel wounds during the fighting. Nothing life-threatening, but he needed medical treatment. At the hospital, military doctors looked at this tiny wounded sailor and became suspicious. They asked his age. Graham insisted he was 17. They didn't believe him. They investigated. They discovered the truth. Calvin Graham was 12 years old. He'd been in combat at Guadalcanal. He'd been wounded. He was a sixth grader who'd fought in one of the war's major naval battles. The Navy was furious. They discharged Graham dishonorably for lying about his age, for forging documents. They stripped him of his disability benefits because his enlistment had been fraudulent. Think about this. The Navy sent a 12-year-old into combat. He fought bravely. He was wounded, and then they punished him for it. Graham returned to Texas. He was 13 now, discharged from the Navy, with no benefits, no recognition. Dealing with injuries from combat. He had to go back to school, back to being a kid. Except he wasn't a kid anymore. Not really. He'd seen men die. He'd fought in battle. He'd done things most adults never experience. And then he was supposed to sit in a 7th grade classroom like none of it had happened. Graham struggled for decades to get his discharge changed and his benefits restored. The Navy refused. He'd lied to enlist, therefore he deserved nothing. It wasn't until 1988, 46 years after he'd fought at Guadalcanal, that the Navy finally granted him an honorable discharge. And it wasn't until 1994 that he received the medals he'd earned, including the Bronze Star and Purple Heart. Graham died in 1992, just before his medals arrived. He was 62 years old. He'd spent 50 years fighting the Navy for recognition of his service, fighting for benefits he deserved, fighting for acknowledgement that he'd served his country, even if he'd been too young to do so. The tragedy of Calvin Graham isn't just that he fought at 12. It's that his own country punished him for it, used him when they needed him, then discarded him when the truth came out. Soviet child soldiers. The sons and daughters of the regiment America had children who lied to enlist, but the Soviet Union had something different. Official child soldiers. Children as young as 6 years old, formally adopted by military units, who lived with the soldiers and participated in combat. They were called sons of the regiment or daughters of the regiment. Children who'd lost their families in the war, been orphaned by German attacks, and were adopted by Red Army units. These weren't children pretending to be older. Everyone knew they were children. The soldiers knew. The officers knew. The government knew. And they armed them anyway. Let me tell you about Sergei Oleshkov. He was 6 years old when German forces attacked his village in 1942. His mother and brother were killed. His home was destroyed. He was alone. A Soviet reconnaissance unit found him hiding in the forest. They couldn't leave a 6-year-old alone in a war zone, so they took him with them, made him their unofficial mascot, the son of the regiment. Sergei lived with the soldiers, ate with them, slept in their barracks, and participated in their missions. At 6 years old, he was too small to carry a rifle, so the soldiers gave him other jobs. He'd crawl through tight spaces to scout enemy positions. He'd deliver messages between units because children attracted less suspicion than soldiers. He'd help treat wounded soldiers. In 1943, during fighting near Stalingrad, the unit's commander was buried alive when a German shell collapsed his command bunker. Other officers were frantically trying to dig him out, but time was running out. Sergei was small enough to crawl into the collapsed bunker through a narrow gap. He found the commander, barely conscious, and helped dig him out from the inside, while soldiers dug from the outside. The commander survived because a 6-year-old child crawled into a collapsed bunker during an artillery barrage to save him. Sergei was awarded a medal for this, at age 6, for bravery under fire. The commander, Major Mikhail Vorobyov, formally adopted Sergei after the war. Sergei lived with Vorobyov's family, went to school, had a normal life, but for 2 years, from age 6 to 8, he'd been a soldier. Sergei's story became famous in the Soviet Union. There were books about him, a movie. He was held up as an example of Soviet patriotism and bravery. But here's what's horrifying. Sergei wasn't unique. There were hundreds, possibly thousands, of sons and daughters of the regiment. Children as young as 6, living with military units, participating in combat operations. Some carried messages, some scouted positions, some helped with medical care, and some, if they were older, like 12 or 13, actually fought, carried weapons, killed enemy soldiers. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival. The Germans had invaded. Millions were dying. Cities were being destroyed. In that desperate situation, the Soviets used every resource they had, including children. After the war, many of these child soldiers struggled. They'd spent formative years in combat instead of in school. They'd seen death and violence when they should have been playing. They'd done things children should never do. Some, like Sergei, were adopted by soldiers and had relatively normal lives after the war. Others ended up in state orphanages, dealing with trauma no one understood how to treat. Post-traumatic stress wasn't recognized in children then. They were just considered difficult or troubled. Youngest pilot, 15 years old in the cockpit. Now let's talk about the youngest combat pilot of World War II. His name was Arkady Kimonin. He was 15 years old when he flew his first combat mission. Arkady was the son of a famous Soviet Air Force general. He grew up around aircraft. By age 14, he could fly a plane better than many adult pilots. He begged his father to let him join the Air Force. His father refused. 14 was too young, even for the desperate Soviet military in 1943. But Arkady persisted. He argued that the Soviet Union needed pilots, that he could fly as well as any adult, that his skills were going to waste while the country was fighting for survival. Eventually, his father relented, pulled strings, got Arkady accepted into a military aviation unit. At 15, Arkady Kimonin became the youngest combat pilot in World War II. He flew reconnaissance missions over German lines. Dangerous work, flying low and slow to photograph enemy positions, while anti-aircraft guns tried to shoot him down. Arkady flew over 30 combat missions before the war ended. He was shot at repeatedly, had his aircraft damaged multiple times, crash-landed twice, but he survived. After the war, Arkady continued in the Soviet Air Force. He became a test pilot, flew experimental aircraft. He should have had a long, distinguished career, but in 1947, at age 19, Arkady died. Not in combat, not in a crash, from meningitis, a disease that was easily treatable, but complications from his wartime injuries made him vulnerable. The doctors said years of stress and physical trauma from combat flying had weakened his immune system. Arkady Kimonin survived years of combat flying as a child, then died at 19 from an illness that shouldn't have killed him. His body, pushed too hard too young, simply couldn't recover. Hitler Youth. Children defending Berlin. Now we need to talk about the darkest part of this story. The children who were deliberately, systematically sent into combat by a desperate, dying regime. The Hitler Youth defending Berlin in 1945. The Hitler Youth was a Nazi organization for children, boys aged 10 to 18. It had existed since the 1920s, originally as a youth movement. By 1936, it was mandatory. Every German boy had to join. Initially, it was mostly propaganda and physical training, camping trips, sports, indoctrination. But as the war turned against Germany, the Hitler Youth became militarized. By 1943, Older Hitler Youth members were manning anti-aircraft guns, defending German cities against Allied bombers. 15 and 16-year-old boys shooting at B-17s and Lancaster bombers. By 1944, Hitler Youth units were being sent to the front lines, not just older teenagers. Children as young as 12, given weapons and sent to fight. And in 1945, as Soviet forces approached Berlin, the Nazis sent thousands of Hitler Youth to defend the city. Children, armed with rifles, Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons, and grenades, ordered to fight to the death against the Red Army. These weren't volunteers. These were conscripts. Children forced into combat by a regime that was using them as cannon fodder in a war it had already lost. The Battle of Berlin was a slaughter. The Soviets outnumbered the defenders massively. They had tanks, artillery, air support. The German defenders included old men from the Volkssturm, the Home Guard, and children from the Hitler Youth. Soviet soldiers reported that some of the fiercest resistance came from Hitler Youth units, not because the children were well trained or well equipped, but because they'd been so indoctrinated that they truly believed they were defending Germany from evil. Children, brainwashed by propaganda, fighting experienced Soviet soldiers. The outcome was inevitable. Thousands of Hitler Youth died defending Berlin. Exact numbers are unknown because records were destroyed in the chaos, but estimates range from 5,000 to 8,000 children killed in the battle. Soviet soldiers were horrified. They'd expected to fight German army units. Instead, they were killing children, 12, 13, 14-year-old boys who'd been handed weapons and told to stop the Red Army. One Soviet officer wrote in his diary, "We found a group of dead Hitler Youth in a defensive position. One of them looked about 12. He was still holding his rifle. This is what the Nazis have become, sending children to die for them. I've seen many terrible things in this war, but this might be the worst." After the battle, the surviving Hitler Youth were captured. Soviet and Allied forces had to figure out what to do with child soldiers. Most were too young to be treated as adult prisoners of war, but they'd been in combat. Some had killed Allied soldiers. Eventually, most were sent to re-education programs, deprogrammed from Nazi ideology, taught that what had happened to them was child abuse, not heroism, that they'd been victims of a criminal regime that had used them as weapons. Many struggled for the rest of their lives. They'd been children in combat. They'd seen friends die. They'd killed people, and then they had to reconcile that with the realization that they'd fought for an evil cause. Some Hitler Youth survivors later said they felt betrayed. They'd believed they were heroes defending their country. Then they learned they'd been disposable tools for a regime that didn't care about them. One survivor, interviewed in the 1990s, said, "I was 13 when they gave me a rifle and told me to fight the Russians. I thought I was being brave. I thought I was protecting Germany. I didn't understand I was just another child being sacrificed, so Nazi leaders could delay their defeat by a few more days." The Warsaw Uprising. Polish child soldiers, August 1944. Warsaw, Poland. The Polish resistance launches an uprising against German occupation. They expect to fight for a few days until Soviet forces arrive to help. Instead, they fight for 63 days. And children fight alongside adults. The Polish Home Army, the resistance organization, officially didn't accept soldiers under 18. But in the chaos of the uprising, that rule became meaningless. Children as young as 8 participated in combat operations. They started as messengers, running between resistance units, carrying orders and information. This was dangerous work. German snipers shot anyone moving through the streets, but children could move faster, hide more easily, slip through small spaces. Then children started fighting, not because adults wanted them to, but because the situation was desperate. The Germans weren't going to liberate Warsaw. They were destroying it, systematically burning buildings, executing civilians, trying to eliminate Polish resistance. Boys aged 12, 13, 14 picked up weapons from dead resistance fighters and joined the battle. Girls of the same age helped build barricades, treated wounded fighters, and sometimes fought when their positions were attacked. The youngest confirmed combatant in the Warsaw Uprising was an 8-year-old boy known as Antek. His real name was Antoni Madic. He served as a messenger for a resistance unit. But during an intense battle, when the unit was surrounded and running out of ammunition, Antek grabbed a rifle and fought. He survived. After the uprising was crushed, he went into hiding. He survived the war. But at 8 years old, he'd been in combat. He'd fired a weapon at German soldiers. He'd seen people die. Over 150,000 civilians died in the Warsaw Uprising. Among them were thousands of children. Some were combatants. Most were just civilians caught in the fighting or executed by German forces as punishment. After the war, the children who'd fought in the uprising were treated as heroes by Polish society. They were called the Little Insurgents. Monuments were built. Books were written. Their bravery was celebrated. But many of these child soldiers struggled. They'd been traumatized by what they'd experienced. They'd been children forced to do adult things, kill, watch friends die, make life or death decisions. One survivor, who'd been 12 during the uprising, said in an interview decades later, "People call us heroes. They say we were brave. But I wasn't brave. I was terrified every moment. I was a child who wanted his mother, wanted to be safe, wanted the shooting to stop. We weren't heroes. We were children in a nightmare." Partisan children, the youngest guerrilla fighters throughout occupied Europe. Resistance movements included children, not officially, not intentionally. But when your country is occupied, when your family is killed, when you're 12 years old and have nowhere to go, you join the partisans. In the forests of Belarus, partisan groups fighting German forces included children as young as 10. They lived in forest camps with adult fighters. They participated in sabotage operations. They fought when the camps were attacked. One of the most famous was a girl named Zinaida Portnova. She was 15 when she joined Soviet partisans in Belarus. She worked as a scout and saboteur. Her youth was an advantage. Germans didn't suspect children. Zinaida would walk into German-controlled towns pretending to be a local girl. She'd observe German positions, count soldiers, note weapons and supplies. Then she'd return to the partisans with intelligence. She also participated in sabotage. Once, she poisoned food at a German military kitchen, killing over 100 German soldiers. She was 15 years old when she did this. In 1943, Zinaida was captured by the Gestapo. They tortured her, trying to get her to reveal partisan locations. She refused to talk. After weeks of torture, they executed her. She was 16 years old. Zinaida was posthumously awarded Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. But she was a child who'd become a guerrilla fighter, a saboteur, and eventually a torture victim, because the war had destroyed her normal life. Similar stories exist from France, Yugoslavia, Italy, everywhere the resistance fought. Children joined partisan groups because they had no other choice, because their families were dead, their homes destroyed, their normal lives impossible. They became fighters by necessity, and many died, never having the chance to grow up. The cost. What happened to child soldiers after the war? We've talked about children who fought. Now let's talk about what happened to them after the war ended. Many didn't survive. Child soldiers had higher casualty rates than adults. They were less experienced, less capable of protecting themselves. In desperate combat situations, they died at horrifying rates. Those who survived faced enormous challenges. They'd missed years of education. They'd been traumatized by experiences most adults never face. They'd done things, seen things, that children should never experience. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't understood in the 1940s. There was no treatment for traumatized child soldiers. They were just expected to readjust, go back to school, act like normal kids, forget what had happened. Most couldn't. Calvin Graham, The 12-year-old sailor struggled with for his entire life. He had nightmares about the Battle of Guadalcanal. He dealt with survivor's guilt, wondering why he'd lived when so many others died. Jacqueline Lucas, the Marine who jumped on grenades at age 17, dealt with chronic pain and health issues from his injuries. But he also dealt with psychological trauma. He'd been in one of the war's bloodiest battles as a teenager. That doesn't go away. The Soviet sons and daughters of the regiment often struggled to adapt to civilian life. They'd spent formative years in military units. They'd bonded with soldiers who then died in combat. They'd seen violence as normal. Adjusting to peacetime was incredibly difficult. Many became discipline problems in schools. They'd talk back to teachers, fight with other students, struggle to follow rules. They weren't bad kids. They were traumatized children who'd learned to survive in combat. And those survival skills didn't translate to classroom behavior. The Hitler Youth who'd fought in Berlin faced a different challenge. They had to reconcile their wartime experiences with the realization that they'd fought for an evil regime, that everything they'd been taught was a lie, that their sacrifices had been for nothing. Some never could reconcile it. Suicide rates among former Hitler Youth were high in the years after the war. The psychological burden of realizing you'd been a child soldier for the Nazis was too much for some to bear. Why this matters? You might be wondering why we're telling these stories. Why focus on this dark chapter of World War II? Why highlight the fact that children fought and died? Because we need to understand the full cost of war. Not just the strategic victories and defeats, not just the political consequences, but the human cost. And part of that cost was paid by children. Tens of thousands of children fought in World War II. Some volunteered, lying about their age. Some were conscripted. Some had no choice because war had destroyed their normal lives. But all of them were children who should have been in school, playing with friends, living normal childhoods. Instead, they fought, killed, watched friends die, dealt with injuries and trauma, and many died, never getting the chance to grow up. Modern international law prohibits the use of child soldiers. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child sets 18 as the minimum age for combat. This exists partly because of what happened in World War II. The world looked at the Hitler Youth defending Berlin, at 12-year-old sailors fighting at Guadalcanal, at 15-year-old partisans being tortured to death, and decided, never again. Children should never fight in wars. But this still happens. Around the world today, children are used as soldiers, in civil wars, by terrorist groups, by desperate governments. The lessons of World War II haven't been fully learned. These stories from World War II aren't just history, they're warnings. They show us what happens when war becomes so desperate that nations start using children. They show us the cost that children pay when adults fail to keep them safe. Jacqueline Lucas threw himself on grenades at 17 and carried the scars for the rest of his life. Calvin Graham fought at 12 and spent 50 years fighting for recognition. Sergei Oleshkov was a soldier at 6 and spent the rest of his life dealing with what he'd experienced. Zinaida Portnova was tortured to death at 16 fighting for her country. These children were brave, heroic even, but they should never have been in positions where bravery was required. They should have been safe, protected, given the chance to be children. That's the lesson. War destroys childhoods. It turns children into soldiers, into victims, into casualties. And every child soldier represents a failure of adults to protect children from violence. The memory today, there are memorials to child soldiers from World War II. In Warsaw, a statue called the Little Insurgent honors children who fought in the uprising. In Russia, monuments commemorate the sons and daughters of the regiment. In America, there are no specific memorials, but Jacqueline Lucas and Calvin Graham are remembered as the youngest Medal of Honor and combat service recipients. These memorials are important, but they're also uncomfortable. Because how do you honor child soldiers without glorifying the use of children in war? How do you recognize their bravery without suggesting that children fighting is acceptable? The survivors struggled with this too. Many didn't want to be celebrated as heroes. They wanted people to understand that what happened to them was tragic, not glorious. One Warsaw Uprising survivor said, "Don't make us into heroes. We were children who were forced to fight. Honor us by making sure it never happens to other children. That's the only way to truly honor what we went through." This is Echoes of W2. Today you learned about the youngest heroes of World War II. Children as young as 6 who were used as soldiers. 12-year-olds fighting in naval battles. 14-year-olds throwing themselves on grenades. 15-year-olds flying combat missions. Your history teacher probably didn't tell you about this. It's uncomfortable. It's dark. It challenges the heroic narrative of World War II. But it's true. It happened. And these children deserve to be remembered, not celebrated, not glorified, but remembered. So we never forget what war does to children. So we never forget that the youngest heroes should never have been heroes at all. They should have been children. Now you know their stories. Now you know what they sacrificed. Now you carry the responsibility to remember them and to ensure that no more children are forced to become warriors. Because the real victory isn't having brave child soldiers. It's creating a world where children never have to fight.